and we promised to sort of bring some more excitement continuing the day's proceedings. We are basically currently the next 3 months or 4 months, I think April 14th is the day that is slated to be the day that India will cross China's population at 1.42 billion people. And China has been the world's most populated country for, I think, almost all of known history. Hundreds of years, maybe a millennia or more. And for the first time, you will have a new country which will be the world's most populated place. And if you look at the trends, that is going to sort of hold for a few hundred years at least, because the population growth rates in various parts of the world indicate that India is going to be in that position for a very long time. The exciting part of this is that we have, started moving towards a time where our infrastructure is getting better. The quality of our, the literacy and skills of our population is getting better. And as a consumption market, India is also becoming attractive. And therefore, this is not just going to be empty numbers. We've been very populated for a long time, and becoming number one from number two is not such a big deal. But when you look at the people in working age, which is the 15 to 64 so-called magic number, looks like India is going to be in a very, very strong position over the next few decades. In fact, apparently at the turn of the century, you'll still have 1 billion plus people of working age in this country, when China will have about, I think, half of that or less than that. So that's a huge opportunity. Now, when everything is on par, then countries with, if everybody's productivity is equal, then countries with higher population obviously are stronger and bigger in terms of the market, and therefore global cloud at whatever that you talk about, the negotiating, inter-country or global high table kind of position. But productivity is not the same in all countries due to various reasons. And in the last 200 years or 300 years, that difference is stark because of technology which started in the West was, gave a very, very significant advantage, making currently, for instance, the global per capita GDP of rich countries like the US at about $58,000. On average, the rich countries are about $40,000. And India is currently at $2,100 or $2,200. It's a great move that we have made from in the last 30 years, ever since we started reforms when we were at 300. But China was also at 300 at that time. China is today around 11,000. He's a better person with numbers. I'm just reading it off my head from a regular reading. China has gone to 11,000, 5 times our size in the last 30 years, because it has had continuous policy regimes, because they did not have pesky democracy sort of derailing reform processes, periodically, which we have had, which we believe is good for us, because we believe growth with democracy, and that's what we talk about, the vibrant democracy global bright spot. In that background, we want to discuss how do we see, this is a very, very celebrated economist and world trends expert. We want to understand from him, from his perch, as to how does he see this whole change that is happening in terms of quantity of the population and changes in the potential, changes in the quality of the population, as to where does it take India. That's the backdrop in which we want to speak with Mr. Augusto Lopez. I'll dive into the questions in a certain sequence, because that's the way that we feel that we would be able to cover more subjects. So India's population growth, we talk about it as positive, but within India, there are regional disparities in population growth. Certain parts of India, mainly the south of India, have population growths which are practically on par with developed nations now. And the northern part of the country has a very high rate of population growth. And there is also disparity in skill levels in regions within India. So how does this play out? Below this great grand number of India has become number one, and the population rate growth is healthy, that our our working age people are going to be great. Within that, how does the regional disparities in skill and growth rate play out, and what are the possibilities, what are the consequences of that, sir?
That's a very good question. I think it's a very good starting point for this conversation. I was actually quite surprised when I looked at the India data on income per capita across the various states. These regional differences in income per capita are quite common throughout the world. If you look at federal states, the United States, if you look at the European Union, you will see these differences, right? There are a couple of things that are surprising about the Indian data. One is just how big the gap is. You have a state like Kerala, which has an income per capita in PPP terms of over $9,000, which is, higher than Ukraine was before the war, right? And then you have Bihar, which is, again, on PPP terms, $2,000, all right? In other words, practically 1/5 of that of Kerala. If you go back to 1990 and you look at the income per capita of the 3 richest states and you compare it with the income per capita of the 3 poorest states, that difference was 50%. 50%. And that is comparable to what you see in the United States today, what you see in the European Union, right? In fact, in those other parts of the world, there has been a tendency for catching up. The poorer countries regions grow faster than the richer countries, and eventually there's some level of catch up. In India, that 50% by today is 3 times. In other words, the gap has widened spectacularly, right? Your rich regions are becoming richer, your poorer regions are are sort of staying behind in a big way. And this is concerning. Now, economists here and elsewhere have looked at this issue and have tried to come up with explanations. They say, well, the poorer regions have very poor infrastructure, they have a lot of red tape, it's difficult to do business, they have an unfriendly environment, and so on and so forth. Some people will say maybe the growth model in India in general has accentuated the regional differences because it has been based on skills-intensive industries like IT and not labor-intensive industries like manufacturing and so on, right? Let me make a somewhat provocative point. There are some parts of the world that have been fantastically successful in narrowing regional differences. And I think that India could do it. India could do it. When I was in my late 20s, I was the IMF economist for Spain. And at that time, Spain was essentially rapidly integrating into the European economy. Together with Portugal, they joined the European Union at the same time, and they were sort of the poor cousins of Europe, right? They were your Bihars of India. Huge difference in income per capita with respect to Germany, the Netherlands, and France, right? You look at the data today, and Spain has caught up, right? Has caught up. In other words, it has gone in exactly the reverse direction of what's happening in India. So how has this happened? Well, the European Union, for its members, has an explicit program, we call it fiscal federalism. It basically consists in countries like Germany and the Netherlands will have an income per capita that is above the average, transfer resources through the European Union budget to the countries that have income per capita below the average, right? And they do it largely, through investments in infrastructure. So Spain and Portugal receive massive amounts of money through the European Union budget from Germany and the Netherlands and France and the rich members, right? And this is what contributed to this convergence, right? I don't think you can do this convergence in India unless you do something like that, where you have an explicit program of transfers through the tax system from the richer regions to the poorer regions. If you don't do that, these differences are going to accentuate, and the problem with income disparities of this nature is that soon they become a political problem, not just an economic problem.
Yeah, that's precisely what I was wondering, because there could already be sort of thoughts coming, because when you look at the political map of India from a state's point of view that I was discussing, it's quite some parts, and the richer parts have local governments which right now are only sort of concerned about their region. When you talk to those ministers in states, they are basically looking at development. But I mean, it could be quite possible in the future, maybe a decade down the line or two, that these guys can come together and ask questions about why is it that resources are moving out of here to there, and what are we getting against that?
Yeah.
So that's one issue. The second one that I want to ask you is on a similar disparity in India, within India, and then I will go to comparing India, is in the so-called working age population of India, we have a very lopsided male-female ratio. Indian women are very, very, compared to the world average, participation in the workforce in sheer quantity and in number of years is much lesser. How will this play out? And what can we do to change that? Because if Indian women don't get to work, then it might look good on paper, but actually the number that actually is available to work culturally may be much lesser than that in terms of man hours.
Yeah. It's true, the data for India show this huge gap in the labor force participation rate of men and women. The last numbers I looked at were for 2021, which is very recent. Labor force participation rate for men were 67%, for women they were 33%. So there is a gap of 34 percentage points, and this is huge. It's not as bad as Iran and Saudi Arabia, okay, where the gap is 50%, 52%. But that's not a good basis of comparison. I hope you will agree with me, right? In Iran, women are second-class citizens. We at the World Bank have identified in Iranian legislation 24 different forms of discrimination against women. So that's not the standard, right? But you need to narrow that gap. And let me just give you a very interesting example from economics, right? When women join the labor force because they have an education and they start working, there is something that we economists call a reallocation of political power within the family. Because since the woman is working, she's contributing to family income. Therefore, she has a say on how the resources are spent. And when this happens, the studies have shown over and over and again in multiple countries that more money gets spent on education, more money gets spent on public health, the savings rate of the family is higher, even the investments are wiser and more profitable, right? And all of this has repercussions for economic growth rate. So by increasing the labor force participation rate of women, there is a huge economic dividend to be derived, for the Indian economy in the future. So your policy should be geared to reduce this gap. Now, how is this done? How does it happen? Well, there are multiple things, First of all, make sure that your laws are squeaky clean in terms of not discriminating against women. You might say, oh, no, in India we don't do that. At the World Bank, we have done studies, 90% of the countries in the world, not 90 of the countries in the world have laws which discriminate against women. Even high-income countries do that, right? So you want to make sure that you don't do that. You have to reduce illiteracy. The literacy figures in India for the 21st century, you're calling yourselves increasingly a global economic and political power. That's fine. I accept that. But your literacy figures are low by international standards. 82% is just not good enough. And in fact, there is also a gap between men and women. For women are much, much lower. So you need to address that issue. It's a waste of resources and so on. And then I'll say something that you may not like. It's a little bit controversial, but I can back it up. We don't have the time tonight, but I have solid empirical evidence, right? Countries that have introduced quotas for the participation of women in parliaments, that have established a floor, right? No less than 30%, no less than 40% for members of both sexes. Believe it or not, when you compare those countries that have quotas with the countries that don't have quotas, the countries that have quotas have a higher labor force participation rate of women, right? So I'm advising you, get your act together on this issue. You know how many women you have in your Indian parliament? 11%. It's one of the lowest in the world. Right? And because of this, I think because women are not politically empowered in your country to the extent that they are in countries that have the quotas, you are paying a very heavy price, right? So the evidence is very, very strong. I certainly hope that you do this because it's going to lead to a much higher participation of women in the labor force. You're going to derive economic dividends from it.
Thank you, Augusto. I think Times Network should take this up as one of the impact campaigns. Maybe we should start talking about, our current participation of females in the parliament. Now coming to a little outside India, we talk about this so-called demographic dividend. What is the current position of skills and literacy of Indians in comparison with other Asian countries which are also growing at the same time, mainly Indonesia? Can India actually provide manufacturing jobs? Can it become a manufacturing destination? Or are competitors in the emerging Asian populations, are they of better quality? What do you think, sir?
Yeah, when I look at your literacy figures, you are doing it, looking at Asia, let's maintain the Asia focus, you're doing better than Bangladesh, you're doing better than Pakistan. You're not doing as well as China, Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, right? And so, again, this is a drag on your economic growth rate. It's a waste of resources, not to have people access, to have access to knowledge and to sort of obtain a much higher level of skills and literacy. This is what public policy is supposed to be about, right? I mean, this has to be a priority of your government. You have to make sure that you invest more on education. Phase out energy subsidies. The last time I looked at the numbers, which I admit was several years ago, India was subsidizing energy consumption, to the tune of several $1 billion per year. Back in 2015, it was like 40-some $1 billion per year, subsidizing, coal, gasoline, electricity, and so on. And this is very bad public policy. First of all, it accelerates climate change, so it makes a problem that is already critical much worse than would otherwise be. And of course, it makes income distribution worse because who benefits from the gasoline subsidy? It's not the poor Indian illiterate villagers, right? It's the middle class. It's the bureaucrats and people who live in the big cities that have big cars and they have big homes to sort of warm up in the winter and so on, right? So your government needs to be much more proactive in terms of establishing spending priorities and focusing more resources on those items of expenditure which are going to boost productivity and improve competitiveness. What are those? Education, infrastructure, public health. Those are the areas that are going to give you more return for your investment. And education has to be very much at the center of that.
Thank you. Talking about India's per capita GDP, which I started off with, I'm not talking about purchasing power parity. I'm talking of the actual number, 2,100. And its trend for the past few years, the world average at around 12,000. My question, which we discussed earlier, how many years do you think India will take to reach world average? Or do you think we'll ever reach there at all? What are the prospects?
Okay, so this is the catching up question. Very, very important question. Countries like India that have an income per capita that is well below the world average, they want to know, how long do we have to wait before we have the standards of living in India that we have, in the more prosperous parts of the world? If I was prime minister in a country, that would be a question that I would wake up every morning asking myself, right? All right, I'll give you a little anecdote. This question is of vital importance for people like me who have spent, much of his professional life at the World Bank, at the IMF, and so on. And a few years ago at the World Bank, we did a simulation, right? So it's an exercise, illustrative. We make some assumptions and we let the computers run and we see what they deliver. And I'll tell you, just bear with me for 1 minute. I'm going to have to share a few numbers with you. What we did is we compared the high-income countries, the Swedens and the Frances and the Netherlands of this world, where average income per capita is $41,000, a couple of years ago, 2-3 years ago, $41,000. And we looked at the low-income countries, where the average income per capita is $700. I will come to India in a couple of minutes, right, and tell you what the relevance of the exercise is for India. And so what we notice is that in the last 20 years, the economic growth rate of the low-income countries has been twice as high as the economic growth rate of the high-income countries. So they're growing more quickly, and this is good. This is good, because if this happens for the next 100 years, they're going to catch up with the, with the high-income countries. So what we did is we said, assume that this differential growth rate, twice as fast for the low income as for the high income, takes place, in the future. It's a working assumption. There are many reasons why that maybe does not happen, but let's assume that it does happen. The question is, how long is it before the low-income countries catch up with the high-income countries, right? That's a vital question. If I am a mother of 2 children in Nigeria, I want to know, should I move to Sweden, where my cousin lives, or should I stay here and invest in the future of my country and to try to make a contribution here? Well, it turns out that when you do the simulation, the gap, the difference between $41,000 and $700 rises. It rises for a long, long time, because you're applying 2.6% to $41,000, and you're applying 4.7% to $700, which is a much lower base, right? So the question is, when does the widening gap actually turn around? And it turns out that it is in the year 2197. When does catch up take place? In the year 2226. In other words, 204 years from now, all right? So we've got ourselves a problem of divergence before we converge, right? So what about India? Well, to answer your question, India has an income per capita of 2,000, right? 2,000, 2,100. So it's 3 times the level of low-income countries on average. And India has been growing more quickly in the last 15, 20 years. I would say 7%, all right? Some years a little more, some years a little less. So those are good things, 2 good things going for India. The answer to your question is it will take several decades. Not to catch up with the high-income countries. That is going to take much longer. To catch up with,
global average.
Yeah.
We started talking about India becoming the most populous country in a few months from now. And we think it's a historic event, once in a millennium or once in a few millennia. What are the benefits? Are there any benefits at all of a large country with a large working age population?
Look, I want to be a little cautious. In the introductory remarks of the very nice people who introduced this panel, there is a certain sense of, optimism, a certain sense of, isn't it great that, India is going to emerge as the world's most populous country? And there is a sense in which that optimism is justified, right? Because, growing population means you are going to have sources of growth. We have to feed these people. We have to build highways. We have to build infrastructure. We have to warm them up in the winter. We have to cool them in the summer. So there's going to be energy consumption, and on and on. We have to build housing for these people, and so there is going to be a huge amount of demand that will have to be met simply to accommodate the needs of these growing population, and that's good. That's good. All right. However, we live in a world in which we are facing environmental constraints. Rapid population growth will also mean that you will put pressure on your resources. I'm thinking in particular water and land, arable land for agricultural purposes. I understand, you know better. I'm not really an expert on the Indian economy, but I have been told by some of my local friends that there are states in India that are already beginning to have a water problem, right? All right, so there you go. And in those states that already have a water problem now, what do you think is going to happen with population growth? Unless there is massive investment, to discover new sources of groundwater, they're going to come under pressure. So it's a balancing act. It's not it doesn't automatically follow that just because you have a growing population, your country is the income per capita is going to rise, rapidly in coming years. It can happen, but it is a function of policies. It is a function of good governance. It is a function of sensible policies. And then, of course, you have, beyond the immediate concerns of national economic policy, you have the broader external environment. You know, we have climate change. That is going to affect all of us, and it's not going to be nice. It's not going to be pretty, and it's going to affect India as much as it's going to affect everybody else. And that will create its own set of challenges, right? So it's not automatic. Don't assume that it's just going to happen, but it can happen. You have to work towards it, and you have to have good governance at the federal level and at the state level.
I'll have two more questions, and these are on international. You studied extensively about economic trends globally during your stint at World Bank and IMF. In a world where China is retreating from globalization, what puts India in an advantageous position compared to China?
This is an interesting question. It's a tricky question. I'm going to have to be very careful the way I answer it, because I don't want to be politically incorrect. Okay, but I'll tell you an anecdote. I'll tell you something that I read in the media, right? I get the Financial Times at home every day, and I, I have breakfast while I'm reading the Financial Times before I go and do real work, right? But there was around the time of the Congress of the Chinese Communist Party a few weeks ago, there was a kind of a sense of disquiet among the many, many multinational companies which have invested heavily in China, right? Because there is a sense that the country is a little bit turning away from sort of the free market principles that were the distinguishing characteristic of Chinese economic development in the last 3 decades, and that the government is more interventionist, more centralizing power, and so on, right? And so somebody asked some American CEO, I don't remember the company, it's one of big global enterprises. Where are you going to build your next plant? As you expand your company, where are you going to do it? And he said, ABC. What does that mean? Anywhere but China, okay? Again, because of the concerns that I just expressed. So what does that mean for a country like India or for a country like Vietnam, right? What are the potential advantages of India in that emerging new global environment, right? With China getting a little bit more inward and getting a little bit more centralized and a little bit more, emerging as a kind of a surveillance state and so on, right? Well, I can think very quickly. India has lowered labor costs, right? China, not anymore, right? Vietnam has low labor costs, so that's another potential competitor, but of course at a smaller scale. English is widely spoken in this country, which I think is a plus in this globalized economy. India is a very large market, and when we do studies, what are the factors that determine the growth of foreign direct investment? There are many of them. Of all those many factors, which is the most important? The size of the domestic market. Because the foreign investors, when they come and they produce here in India to export in Asia, if they can produce here for a very large growing market, it makes the investment very profitable, right? And so that's greatly to your advantage. And then, of course, India is a democracy. Maybe an imperfect democracy, but it's a democracy. There is accountability, at least from the little Indian history that I know, I can think of at least a few examples where the government wasn't doing so well, and what happened at the next election, they lost out. And this process of legitimization, this process of, going through, and giving the voters the ability to change course if necessary is tremendously important. Autocracies don't have that. Autocracies, I believe strongly, and I can back it up, are ultimately incompetent, right? And I know a little bit about this, because in the 1990s, I was the IMF resident representative in Moscow. I spent 4.5 years in the Russian Federation. I arrived there at the tail end of the Soviet Union, right? And I assure you, autocracies and authoritarian governments, ultimately they are not successful in delivering sustained prosperity.
Thanks a lot. That's really a bright point on India's so-called democratic dividend, which we've been talking about, besides the demographic dividend. The last question of the day. While we believe India is a bright spot, and that's what we want to sort of believe and We believe that we will make it happen. At least in the short run, right now we look much better than world trends. What are your views on the immediate headwinds of inflation, global, energy supply, and global geopolitical situation between Russia and Ukraine? And of course, before that, China and US, which had already started off with Trump, that whole tug of war.
Right.
So, globalization, issues on headwinds of inflation, energy supply, Russia, Ukraine, and China, US.
Okay. Very quickly, because I'm standing here between you and dinner, and that's always a very risky proposition. So I'll try to be very quick. Look, on inflation, we're coming out of a period of nearly 15 years, since the global financial crisis of 2007, when we had extremely loose monetary policies, right? So because of COVID, supply chain disruptions, and of course, the war in the Ukraine and the very sharp increase in commodity prices, wheat, corn, fertilizers, and so on, inflation has picked up in a big way. And now what's happening in the world at large, from the Fed in the United States to the European Central Bank, the Bank of England, everybody is focused on bringing inflation down, because we don't want to embed inflationary expectations and get into a kind of a wage price spiral, right? So interest rates have been going up, and the risk is that it is not easy to engineer through interest rate increases a transition to a lower inflation path without at the same time generating a recession, okay? And that's what's happening in the world today. You see countries basically, trying to manage expectations, trying to increase interest rates in a way that does not lead, to the collapse of output and to sustained recession. Will they succeed? I wish I knew. I'm cautiously optimistic that if there is a recession in 2003, it will be a mild one, and that output will recover and will pick up. But that's where we are at the moment, right? Now, energy. When Russia invaded Ukraine and energy prices picked up in a big way, and natural gas in particular, because Europe is very dependent on Russian gas. I began to hear, more and more governments talking about energy security, energy supply, and so on. And I said, this is going to be lethal for climate change, because people are going to use the current crisis as an excuse, basically, not to do more on the transition to a renewable energy economy. I am more optimistic today. I'm more optimistic today because I see that countries are, Europe in particular, is going out of its way to essentially accelerate that transition to a renewable energy. Europe is never again going to buy energy from Russia for the foreseeable future, because they don't want to deal with a country that uses trade as a form of blackmail, for coercion. Either you trade because it is mutually benefit. But if trade becomes a political weapon, then you don't want to deal with that. And for that reason, I'm very pessimistic about the future of the Russian economy. I think the Russian economy is imploding. It is, the economy is being destroyed by the sanctions and by the unprovoked actions of the government against the Ukraine. I think that you know very well the war is not going very well for them, and I think it's really. For me, who spent many years in Russia in the 1990s advising the government on how to manage the transition to a more efficient economy, a market economy, to see this reversal, is a sad story. It's a sad story, but what can we do? More generally, sort of looking at the broader international context, right? And this is the last point I want to make. Not on this visit to India, but a few years ago when I visited Delhi, I went to your beautiful Lotus Temple, right? You have all been to the Lotus Temple, right? And the head of the Baha'i community in the 1930s said that the challenge that we face today is that our economic and political institutions were not adapting themselves sufficiently rapidly to the needs of an evolving world. right? The world is changing. Science and technology are changing. The landscape is changing as we speak, year after year. He said that 90 years ago. It remains absolutely true today. So we have an urgent need today to essentially rethink our global governance architecture. We need to think the way in which we do international cooperation, because it's not working. Climate change is an impending calamity, and we're not dealing with it. Nuclear proliferation, that's another source of risk in the world. We only have one agreement left, which expires in 2026, concerning the control of nuclear weapons, which is the START agreement. Once that is phased out, we're going to be in no man's land. And of course, we have other problems, you know, malnutrition, poverty, et cetera, et cetera. So the challenge today is, you know, we need to rethink that architecture of global governance. And my final point is, and it's a question to you, India has to participate in that process. You have to be at the table. If you're going to emerge as the most populous country in the world, for me it is unthinkable that as we think, you know, what kind of a world we want in the future and how we are going to get there, that future is going to be shaped without Indian voices, right? And therefore, I personally would like to see more of the leadership role by India on global fora, at the United Nations, at the General Assembly, you know, at the IMF and the World Bank and the World Health Organization, you know. At the moment, I hope you don't mind my saying this, there is a gap between your presence and the way you are contributing to these debates on the one hand, and your own sense of optimism about, you know, India emerging as a global economic and political power. That may well happen, but then it has to be accompanied by a much stronger footprint on the kinds of debates that are going to take place about what kind of future we want, right? And at the moment, you're deferring a little too much. Let the Europeans work on that one. Let the Americans work on that one, you know? We'll focus on the sort of local problems that we have. I don't think that's a good policy for the longer term. You need to enhance your presence on the global stage. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Augusto. That was really, really fantastic.